Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Laramie and today we are going to talk about knitting supplies for the absolute beginner. Last week I published a pretty rambly video about everything that I wish I knew before I knitted my first sweater. And in that video I talked about the supplies that I actually use when I knit a sweater. And so today what I want to do is I want to expand on that discussion while also making this like a much shorter video so that if you're not really into that like video ramble style where I'm kind of telling stories, you can just watch this video and get to the point. So this is geared towards two like sections of people. The first section is geared towards people who have never knitted before and are ready to start learning how to knit. And then the next section is for people who have learned how to knit or started knitting but are ready to expand their notions or supplies for their knitting. So I'm gonna start with the to knit your very first item section and talk more about that. So I have a few examples here in front of me of things I wanna show, but there are really only three things that you need to have on hand in order to begin learning how to knit. The first is yarn. You have to have yarn to learn how to knit or some kind of string of something to learn how to knit. And I recommend staying away from like a very thin yarn. I recommend something like a worsted weight yarn or a DK weight yarn. And if you have no idea what that means, that is just like a thicker style of yarn. So this is a worsted weight. And then I have a DK weight here from this sweater. This one right here is DK weight. Basically, if you're looking at yarn and you're trying to decide what to get as a beginner, the smallest size I would get is a DK weight, which it will have a number 3 on the back of the yarn. Worsted will have a number 4 or like be like a medium listed on the back of the yarn. And then anything bigger would be really good for a beginner. I would just steer clear away from those like lace weight yarns, anything listed as fingering or sock weight. Those are going to be very difficult for you to kind of get a hang of holding on to because they're so small and the act of knitting is already hard enough if you've never knitted before. Then if you add like tiny yarn to that equation, you're also adding tiny needles and you're just making it more complicated than it needs to be. Now, you do you, but this is my recommendation. I would stick to a size 3 or a weight 3 of yarn and above. So any yarn that has a 3 or a higher number on the back of it would probably be a good place to start for a beginner. I believe I started with a worsted weight, which is about a size 4, and I had pretty good luck with that. My next recommendation in terms of yarn is going to be to steer clear from slippery yarns. So yarns like bamboo from rayon, silk, some cotton can even be difficult to work with as a beginner. Even though cotton's not slippery, but there's some challenges with cotton. I would stick with something like acrylic, or if you can, if you're not allergic to it and it's within your like price range, I would start on a untreated or a non-superwash wool. So basically that's wool that hasn't gone through a treatment process to make it so it can go through the washer. So any items with a non-superwash wool cannot be machine washed or machine dried. So keep that in mind. But I started on acrylic. Acrylic to me is a little more difficult to work with than something like a non-superwash wool. It is like, this is my recommendation. If you're gonna go out and buy something, I recommend Lion Brand's Fisherman's Wool because it is very grippy, because it's not super slippery, it's not super slick, and it's worsted weight, so it's fairly easy to hold on to. And as you are knitting, you're not gonna have to worry about it sliding off your needles as much as say like a really slick polyester or something like silk or rayon from bamboo. So as you are learning how to knit, for the very first time you knit, you wanna go with a grippier yarn. Non-superwash wool, specifically this one, this Lion Brand's Fisherman's Wool, is pretty affordable. This is a pretty good ball or skein of yarn. And I think this was maybe $11 for this whole thing. And so if I had to give you a recommendation for what to get as a very beginner for the first few projects you're gonna knit while you're learning how to do those knit stitches and those purl stitches, I would start with this because it's a lot of yarn. It's pretty accessible, it's fairly affordable, and it is not slippery, so it's pretty easy to work with. It's one of my favorite yarns to knit. However, I don't like wearing it for garments, but if you're like practicing by knitting a scarf, this would be a good place to go. Just keep in mind, if you're gonna start knitting washcloths, this is maybe not a good place to start. Then I would consider starting with the cotton. But if you're just, now I'm rambling a little bit, but if you're just learning how to knit and how to purl, and you're okay with working with wool and not being able to use it as like a scrub brush, this may be a good place to start. This is where I would recommend you start. So that was yarn. Now moving on to needles, I recommend that you get a wooden needle. Now I started knitting on yarn that I got from Goodwill that was just happened to be acrylic yarn, and a pair of wooden chopsticks that you get from like the Chinese restaurants. They come in those like paper envelopes, and I just filed down the ends to a point, and I use those as my knitting needles, and I learned how to knit just fine on those. But if you are interested in using like actual knitting needles, and you are willing to spend the money on some actual knitting needles, then I recommend getting some kind of wooden or bamboo knitting needle, and this is also to avoid that slippery factor. I really like knitting with metal or stainless steel knitting needles now. This is a ChiaoGoo, and this is all I pretty much knit with at this point. But metal is very slippery, and so again, while you're trying to learn how to do knit stitches and purl stitches and how to hold the needles, how to manage the yarn, having a slippery needle, especially if you have a fairly slippery yarn, is going to make things much more difficult. So I recommend either getting a straight set of wooden needles, just your traditional straight wooden knitting needles. I'll put a picture up on the screen somewhere, or getting some kind of like circular knitting needle that's wooden that has a cable. Actually, if I had to choose one, this is what I would recommend. I would get, not necessarily this brand or anything, but I would get wooden knitting needles that are circular, and then I would use for the cable. This one only has a 24-inch cable, but I would get a 40-inch cable so that you can knit different sizes of things. And you don't have to knit these in the round. Circular knitting needles are generally used if you're knitting something in a circle, like the body of a garment. But I also like to use circular knitting needles for knitting things flat. So in fact, I'm knitting some kind of either rug or wall hanging undetermined flat. So I'm just knitting it back and forth, but I'm still knitting it on, I think this is like a 60-inch cable. Maybe it's a 40-inch cable. But I like that I can like rest the work in my lap, and I also never have to worry about losing one needle because it's always attached to the other. So my recommendation would be some kind of wooden or bamboo circular knitting needle with a 40-inch cable, just so that you have some flexibility in the size of the work that you want to take on or the size of the project. As far as needle size goes, they're often listed in millimeters and US measurements. Either one you want to pay attention to, you can. Most patterns list both the US measurement and the like millimeter measurement. But whatever you get, you're just going to want to match the yarn that you get. So start by finding out what yarn you want to use. If you decide to go with the Lion Brand Lion Brand Fisherman's Wool, on the back here, and I'll throw up a picture so you can see this a little better, it says medium 4, so that tells you the size of the yarn, and then below that it's got this knitting needle and it says 9, which is the US size, and 5.5 millimeters. So if I were starting to knit, or I was putting together like a knitting kit for a new beginner, I would throw this in there. I would grab them a US 9 or a 5.5 millimeter set, wooden or bamboo with a 40-inch cable, and that would go together. As you get better at knitting and as you begin to knit more complex things, you may learn to adjust your needle size in order to hit gauge, which is how many stitches you have per inch or per centimeter. But that's not something you need to worry about if you don't even know how to knit or purl. So I would start with just match whatever needle is recommended by the yarn you're using and go from there. Like everything else you can learn later, this is where you need to start. So that's your yarn and your needles. The third thing that you need is a pair of scissors of some kind of cutting tool. And this is not something that you should have to purchase. In theory, unless you're starting from complete scratch, you probably have like fingernail clippers, a knife, a pair of scissors. Maybe your kid has a pair of scissors. Maybe you are a kid and you have a pair of scissors. any of that, like anything that will cut yarn will work. Like you don't need to go out and buy anything for this. I used just like my kitchen scissors for the longest time. I had some scissors in my office that I've used. I still to this day haven't purchased scissors specifically for my knitting. I did happen to like come across in a bag that I bought from Goodwill, a pair of these like little nippers, and they work really well. And I like how small they are, and I carry these with me everywhere. But I didn't, like, you don't need to go out and buy something specific. But that's it. If you are a brand new baby knitter, or you have never picked up a set of knitting needles and you want to knit, those are the 3 things you need. You need some kind of yarn, preferably size 3 and up, preferably something that's not super slippery, slick. You need a set of knitting needles that match your yarn size, told to you by the label on the yarn. And I recommend wood, and then, or bamboo. And then your third is you just need something that can cut your yarn. Some people just break their yarn, like they just take their hands and they break it. I was never a fan of that, but that's also an option if you're in a pinch, though that's probably easier on something like wool than it would be to break like acrylic or polyester yarn. I think that would be a lot harder. But that's it. If you are knitting your very first thing, that's my recommendation. Now, if you're like, Laramie, I want to knit a washcloth, so I don't really want to knit with wool for my very first thing, then I would consider getting a cotton. Just get like a cheap cotton, but just know that, at least in my experience, cotton is a little harder to knit with. Like it's harder on your hands to knit with than a wool or an acrylic. But if you are wanting to make use of the first things that you knit, then a cotton is a great idea, because then you can use that in your kitchen or in your bathroom as like little scrubbies, and you only have to make little swatches, which will help you learn different stitches. That's actually what I did. I don't have them on me. I'm at my parents' house right now, but I made a bunch of like squares, honestly like 5x5, 4x4, 6x6 squares, where I practiced different like stitches, and then I just gave them to my friends, and I kept a few to use as washcloths. And it worked out great, and I happened to be using a cotton at this point in time. I started on an acrylic yarn, and I knitted a scarf with my chopsticks. So that's where I began. Now, if you have a beginner kit already, you've knitted a few things, you're ready to up your game, and you want to add a few notions, a few supplies to your kit, there are a few things that I recommend, and these are going to be the things that I actually think that you need as you advance your like knitter kit. These are the things that I consider necessities. In this video, I'm not going to include anything that I consider a nice to have, though I may reference like nice to have versions of the things that I think you need. So the first thing is a soft/flexible measuring tape. Any beginner like sewing kit, any craft store you go to, I think you can get these even at like Walmart. And I'm thinking of the soft measuring tapes that are just like you have to roll them up manually. That is what you really need in some shape or form as a knitter, especially if you're going to be knitting any kind of garment. And maybe I should say specifically if you're going to be knitting any kind of garment, because you need to be able to take your own measurements, and you need to be able to measure the item, the garment that you are knitting. So your basic, like what you need is some kind of measuring tool, and it needs to be flexible. A fancier version of this would be a retractable flexible measuring tape like this one that I got online. On one side it has centimeters, on the other it has inches. You squeeze this and it closes up. Love this thing. If I ever lose this, I'm buying 2 more because these are amazing. I like that you don't have to manually wrap them up. So there's not like I don't know, maybe you're not like this, but I often avoided using my soft measuring tape solely because I didn't want to go through the effort of like wrapping it back up, which is so ridiculous. But it's true, it's who I am. So I got one of these, and it goes out, I think it only goes out to 60, let me take a look. Yeah, it only goes out to 60 inches, but for me that is plenty to measure around my body, or to measure like height. But that is like my luxury version of this item. The cheaper, normal version of this item is just the soft measuring tape that you could just like wrap back up or roll into a little ball. And then my super cheap, you don't have to buy anything probably, hack is just using a length of yarn. You can use a length of yarn to measure like a circumference of something, and then you can hold it up to a ruler. You could hold it up to like a measuring tape like this, so that you can measure how long your string is, or even like a yardstick. Anything like that would work as a like soft flexible measuring tape. Just take your yarn, mark where it meets in the front if you're like measuring your bust, lay it flat, and then use one of these or a ruler to see how long that measuring tape is, or how long that piece of string or yarn is, and that'll tell you what your circumference of your bust is. If you want to get super fancy, you could get some like more expensive, better quality ones of these, but this one's pretty cheap. Anything like this would work. There's a lot of different brands. You find what works best for you. And you can get a lot of these at like local craft stores, but I think this is worth it. It's not very much more than just a regular soft measuring tape, and the retractable just makes it so much easier to like carry around and use. So that's the first one. My second is stitch markers. And by this, I mean anything that just marks a stitch. So if you are like not wanting to spend a lot of money, you just need to take a little chunk of yarn and tie it into a circle. You can use ponytails. I have used like rings, like old, like cheap rings that I had from when I was a kid. I actually keep them in this little bag here just in case I need them. A lot of knitting supplies will come with these little types of stitch markers. They work great. You can get fancier. You can get like metal stitch markers that clip on and off, or you can just use yarn. And that is like any kind of stitch marker that you need, or any kind of item that can mark a stitch, that's perfectly fine. I am a big fan. Let's see if I think I have one on here, maybe. Oh no, not anymore. Maybe I have one in here. My favorite stitch markers, I don't think they make them anymore, but they're Boy, and they're elastic stitch markers with a little plastic ball on the end. These are my favorite, but I've also used paper clips to mark my stitches. Actually, when I split for the sleeves, or started working the raglan on this sweater, I was here at my parents' house, and I, for some reason, didn't bring any stitch markers. And then they had a little thing of paper clips, and I used paper clips to mark all my raglan increases, and it worked like a dream. It worked just fine. I didn't even update or change them. I just left them until I finished the raglan sleeves or raglan seams and moved on. So any kind of stitch marker, you do you. If you want to buy some, you can. If you want to just use what you have, that's perfectly fine. I have used all different combinations of things. In a pinch, anything that can be tied onto your needle and like moved with your stitches will work. The next thing you need is tapestry needles. And I will say with this, I really do think tapestry needles are a necessity, but I do have a suggestion if you aren't ready to buy tapestry needles that will work as an alternative to them. You can see my little paper clip in here too. Tapestry needles are pretty easy to find. You can find them online. Any craft store will have something like this. The important thing is they have like a relatively blunt end. They're not super sharp. And then the eye of the needle is big enough to fit your yarn through. So these blue ones are for like really chunky yarn. These are for like these smaller metal ones are for your like worsted weight and below. And so just get a pack of these and you're good to go. If you don't want to use or buy these tapestry needles, and these are for weaving in your ends when you're done with the project, you can go ahead and get crochet hooks. Or if you already have a crochet hook on hand, you can use a crochet hook to weave in your ends, though I find the tapestry needle to just be a lot more user-friendly and a lot quicker, but feel free to use a crochet hook if you would rather. But I think you need some tool to weave in your ends as a necessity in your kit. For me, a tapestry needle is a necessity. I will say though, for the fourth item I have on here, a crochet hook is also a necessity for me. I have two with me. If you watched my last video, you know why. I have two with me because I am knitting a fingering weight project, so I have a really small crochet hook, and I'm knitting a worsted / DK weight project, so I have a bigger crochet hook. Crochet hooks are really good for picking up dropped stitches. So at first, when I first started knitting, I didn't worry about drop stitches. I was just trying to get the process of knitting down. What is a knit stitch? What is a purl stitch? But then when I started knitting actual things that I wanted to keep and I wanted to last, I decided to get some crochet hooks. I just got a whole set of cheap crochet hooks online, but you can just get one. I recommend like a 3.5 millimeter because this will help you pick up your like dropped stitches. And then for my fingering weight projects, I have a 2 millimeter, and this kind of works for the whole like gambit of like sock weights that you could have. But I think this is a necessity too. So if you don't want to get two things, if you don't want to get a crochet hook and a tapestry needle, just get a crochet hook, and you can just get one. Just get a crochet hook and use that to weave in your ends as well as pick up dropped stitches. But for me, this is an absolute necessity. Honestly, that's it. When I was creating this list, I really thought that I would have more on it, but really these are the necessities. You need yarn, you need knitting needles, you need some kind of cutting tool, a tape measure of some, ooh, Theo just scared me. I have the door shut to my bedroom and he just scratched on the door and I definitely just jumped. Okay, so where was I at? You need some kind of measuring device. You need, oh, now he's whining. Okay, I'm gonna let him in. You wanna come in? I'm filming, buddy. Yeah, you wanna come sit with me? You wanna come sit with me? Come here. Show the people your presents. You need a haircut. Come here. Okay, anyways, let me just start this section over. You need yarn, you need needles, you need scissors or some kind of cutting tool. You need a soft, flexible measuring tape or yarn and like one of these or a ruler. Whoop, are you okay, honey? You need a tapestry needle or a crochet hook to weave in your ends. I also have crochet hook on here, and that's it. So that is what? That's 6 items, including your yarn and your knitting needles. So that's all. That's really all I have. I don't have much more to say about that. There are a lot of like nice to haves in knitting, and some of them that I do use. I believe that any kind of purchase stitch marker is a nice to have because there's some, and now he wants back out. Okay. Like the stitch markers that you purchase are all a nice to have. Anything that you can make at home or have on hand is a necessity for a stitch marker. Everything, like anything else, like a row counter. I have a stitch marker, actually I'm using it right now, that has, let me try not to drop my stitches here, that has numbers on it. Goodness, it does get tangled in my yarn quite a lot, but that has numbers on it so I can keep track of what row I'm on. That is a luxury. You can just use a pencil and paper. Same with a stitch counter, you can use a pencil and paper. I can't think of really anything other luxuries that I use because really, like I'm at my mom's house, the things that I've brought with me are the things that I use when I knit, and I need them whether I'm at home or whether I'm out on the go. And it's just these 6 things that I bring with me every time I do any kind of knitting, even more advanced knitting. And in that case, like I will also bring a printed copy of the pattern. I may bring my other knitting needles just in case I need different sizes. But really these 6 things are, like if I had to go back and like if my whole entire kit disappeared, everything disappeared, these are the 6 things that I would need in order to be able to knit. Editing Laramie here. If you happen to be somebody who has knitted a little bit, please let me know in the comments if I missed anything that you would consider a necessity, or if some of my things that I've mentioned as luxuries are actually necessities to you. And also let me know if you have any other like tips and tricks for beginners or supplies that may be useful to them. And also if you are a beginner, let me know if there's anything that you have used recently that was really beneficial to your knitting. All right, that's all I wanted to add. I hope you were able to get some information out of this. It was a lot shorter than the last video, so hopefully if you were overwhelmed by the last video and you couldn't watch it all the way through, you were able to get what you needed out of this video. Anyways, I'm happy you're here. I am gonna end this video. I'm getting worse at ending videos. I need an outro, but I don't have an outro. So I'm just gonna tell you to have a good day. If you liked the video, go ahead and feel free to like it. Subscribe if you want to hang out some more. And then if you have any questions or recommendations or comments, go ahead and leave them below and I will answer them. I will see you next time. Bye.